Evan Turner, a determined black teenager with a passion for aviation, crosses paths with billionaire Grant Hayward at a private airport. When Evan's intuition warns him of a looming disaster, he takes a bold step to stop Hayward from boarding his jet. But is his warning a stroke of fate or just a baseless hunch? What happens next will challenge everything they know about trust and destiny. Before we dive into this unforgettable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will leave you inspired. Evan Turner wiped the smudge of grease off his hand with a rag that used to be white. His summer job at Lincoln Airfield was hardly glamorous, but for a 17-year-old with dreams of becoming a pilot, it was as close to the sky as he could get. He'd spent the last 2 months cleaning private jets, refueling small planes, and listening to mechanics argue over what constituted a serious engine problem. It wasn't flying, but it was a step toward the cockpit. Today, Evan was finishing his shift when the sleek Gulfstream G700 taxied into the hangar. The jet gleamed in the overhead lights, its pristine silver body a stark contrast to the modest planes parked around it. It was a billionaire's toy, and everyone at the airfield knew it belonged to Grant Hayward. The tech mogul was a legend and a terror, depending on who you asked. Evan had only seen Hayward once before, stepping out of the jet with the kind of confidence that made people move out of his way without him saying a word. He was tall, sharp-featured, and always in a suit that probably cost more than Evan's mom made in a month. Today the billionaire was here again, his arrival setting off a flurry of activity. "Careful with that fuel line," barked Pete, one of the senior mechanics. "You don't want to be the guy who screws up Hayward's jet." Evan smirked. Pete's words were meant for the rookie mechanic beside him, but the man was too nervous to laugh. Even the staff who didn't work directly on Hayward's plane treated it like it was made of glass. Evan didn't blame them. The mogul had a reputation for firing people for mistakes, even if they weren't on his payroll. As Evan watched the team work, a creeping unease settled in his chest. It wasn't new. For weeks he'd been having vivid dreams about this very jet. In them, he'd see it high above the clouds, its engines roaring, and then a sudden explosion. The dreams always ended the same way: wreckage tumbling from the sky, fire reflected in the ocean below. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. Dreams were just dreams. They didn't mean anything. But as Hayward's jet rolled to a stop, Evan couldn't ignore the knot in his stomach. It felt like something was off, like the air around the plane was charged with tension. He didn't believe in premonitions, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. Turner Pete's shout snapped him out of his thoughts. "Go grab the cleaning kit. We've got fingerprints on the jet." Evan muttered a quick on it and jogged to the supply closet. He grabbed the kit and headed back to the hangar, where Hayward was stepping out of a sleek black car. The man was on his phone, his voice low and clipped as he barked orders to someone on the other end. He didn't even glance at Evan as he strode toward the jet's steps. "Flights in 20, Hayward announced, snapping his phone shut. "Let's move." The staff scrambled to make final preparations. Evan started wiping down the jet's smooth surface, his reflection staring back at him from the polished metal. The unease in his chest grew heavier with each swipe of the cloth. "Evan, you good?" asked Ryan, another mechanic. "Yeah, just tired," Evan lied. He didn't feel like explaining the dreams or the gut feeling gnawing at him. Ryan nodded and walked away, leaving Evan alone with his thoughts. When the last fingerprint was wiped away, Evan stepped back to admire his work. The jet was spotless, its sleek design practically daring the sky to challenge it. But instead of feeling satisfied, Evan felt dread. His mind replayed the dream, the roar of the engines, the explosion, the fire. He glanced at Hayward, who was now speaking with the pilot. The man didn't look like someone who listened to warnings from teenage airport staff. But Evan couldn't let him get on that plane, not without saying something. His heart pounded as he took a step toward Hayward. What was he even going to say? "Don't get on your jet because I had a bad dream." He'd sound insane. But if he said nothing and something really did happen? "Mr. Hayward," Evan's voice rang out, louder than he intended. Everyone in the hangar turned to look at him. Hayward's sharp gaze zeroed in on the teenager. What Hayward's tone was flat, impatient. Evan hesitated. The weight of everyone's stares was suffocating, but he forced himself to speak. "You shouldn't get on that plane." The hangar went silent. Even Pete, who had been adjusting a landing gear light, froze mid-motion. Hayward's expression shifted from irritation to curiosity, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. Evan swallowed hard. "I have this feeling. Something's wrong with the plane. I think it's dangerous." Hayward stared at him, his face unreadable. Then he let out a sharp laugh, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "A feeling? That's what you stopped me for." Evan's cheeks burned, but he held his ground. "I know how it sounds, but I'm serious. I've been having these dreams about your jet. Crashing. Exploding. It's like I don't know how to explain it, but I can't just stand here and do nothing." The billionaire's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me not to board my $70 million jet because of your dreams?" "Yes," Evan said, his voice firmer than he felt. Hayward looked at the pilot, then at Pete. "Is there anything wrong with the jet?" "Not that we've found," Sir Pete said quickly. "It passed all inspections this morning." "There's nothing wrong," Hayward repeated, turning back to Evan. "You're wasting my time, kid." "I'm not," Evan insisted, his voice rising. "Please, just have it checked again. I'm begging you." The hangar erupted in whispers. The mechanics exchanged nervous glances, while the pilot shifted uncomfortably. Hayward's jaw tightened as he looked at Evan, sizing him up. "Fine," Hayward said at last, "I'll have it checked again." "But if you're wrong, you're fired." Evan's stomach dropped. He hadn't even considered the possibility of losing his job. But as the billionaire stormed toward the mechanics, he felt a small flicker of relief. At least he'd done something. As the inspection began, Evan stepped back, his hands trembling. He'd just gambled everything on a gut feeling. And if he was wrong, he'd be the laughingstock of Lincoln Airfield. He watched as the mechanics worked, their movements brisk and precise. Hayward stood nearby, arms crossed, glaring at Evan like he was daring him to speak again. The tension in the air was palpable, every second dragging like an hour. Finally, Pete approached Hayward, wiping his hands on his overalls. "Sir, we didn't find anything major. Just a loose fuel cap. It's been secured." Evan's heart sank. "A loose cap? That was it?" He looked at Hayward, whose lips curved into a smirk. "See," Hayward said. "Nothing to worry about. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a flight to catch." Evan opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Hayward turned and began climbing the jet's steps, his silhouette framed by the hangar lights. The knot in Evan's stomach tightened into a vise. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Something was still wrong, he could feel it. But as Hayward disappeared into the jet, Evan realized he might be out of time. He stood frozen on the tarmac, the weight of his decision crushing him. Had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? Or was it the one thing that would save them all? Evan stood rooted to the tarmac, watching as Grant Hayward disappeared into the cabin of his luxurious Gulfstream G700. The heavy door sealed shut behind the billionaire with a mechanical hiss, and Evan's pulse quickened. His instincts screamed at him something wasn't right. But what could he do? He'd already made a scene, and the plane had passed inspection. His boss, Pete, was glaring at him like he was about to get chewed out in front of the entire crew. "Turner, what the hell was that?" Pete stormed over, his boots clanking against the concrete. "You don't stop a man like Grant Hayward over a gut feeling. Do you know what you've just done?" "I'm sorry," Pete, Evans said, his voice shaky but resolute. "I couldn't let him get on without saying something. You saw the fuel cap was loose. What if I'm right about more?" Pete rubbed his temples, clearly at the end of his patience. "The cap was nothing. You've embarrassed me, you've embarrassed yourself, and now Hayward thinks we're all a bunch of amateurs." Evan swallowed hard, but he didn't back down. "If I didn't say something and something happened, how could I live with that?" Pete's face softened slightly, but his voice stayed gruff. "Kid, I get it. You're young, and you think you can save the world. But this isn't a movie. Hayward's people checked that jet top to bottom, and now you're just another liability on my team. Go cool off before you lose your job for real." Evan clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Pete was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. But the truth was, Evan had no proof, just a series of recurring dreams and a gut instinct that everyone seemed to dismiss. As Pete walked away, Evan's gaze drifted back to the jet. The engines roared to life, sending a deep vibration through the air. The sleek aircraft began to roll toward the runway, its powerful turbines spewing heat waves into the summer evening. Time slowed as Evan watched it move, a gnawing sense of dread clawing at his chest. He couldn't let this happen. Not yet. He had to try again, no matter the cost. Evan sprinted across the tarmac, his sneakers slapping against the concrete. He waved his arms wildly, signaling to the ground crew and anyone who might stop the plane. "Wait," he yelled. "Stop the jet." The pilot, already taxiing toward the runway, must have seen him through the cockpit window. The Gulfstream shuddered to a halt, its engines winding down as the brakes engaged. Hayward's head appeared in the cabin window, his sharp features twisted into an expression of utter disbelief. Moments later, the cabin door reopened, and Hayward emerged, his temper boiling over. "What is this now?" he barked, descending the steps with a commanding presence. "Are you trying to cost me more time, kid?" Evan stood his ground, his chest heaving. "I know how this looks, Mr. Hayward, but I couldn't just let you go without saying something. The fuel cap might not be the only issue. What if something else is wrong?" Hayward's jaw tightened as he stared at Evan, his gaze cold and unforgiving. "Let me get this straight. You're basing this entire circus on a hunch, a feeling." Evan nodded, his resolve unwavering despite the billionaire's growing anger. "Yes, sir. I can't explain it, but I know something's off. Please, just check the plane again. One more time." Hayward scoffed, turning to Pete, who had arrived on the scene looking mortified. "Is this how you run things here? Letting your staff harass my team and delay my flight over childish nonsense?" Pete opened his mouth to respond, but Evan interrupted him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayward, but this isn't about me or my job. It's about your safety. Please, just one more inspection." For a long moment, Hayward didn't move. He simply stared at Evan, his calculating eyes scanning the young man's face as if trying to decide whether to unleash his fury or consider his words. Finally, he sighed and waved a dismissive hand. "Fine. Have it checked again," Hayward said, his voice dripping with annoyance. "But this is the last time. If you're wrong, you'll never work in aviation again." Evan's heart raced as the mechanics began another inspection. He could feel Hayward's piercing gaze on him, and the weight of his earlier outburst pressed heavily on his shoulders. But despite the stakes, Evan felt a flicker of hope. He had convinced the billionaire to give him another chance. Now all he could do was wait and pray he was right. The evening air was tense as the crew resumed their inspection of Grant Hayward's Gulfstream G700. Mechanics crouched around the landing gear and engine compartments, their tools clinking softly in the heavy silence. Evan stood at a distance, his heart hammering as he tried to steady his breathing. He had done all he could. Now it was out of his hands. Grant Hayward leaned against a nearby service truck, his gaze cold and unforgiving. His arms were crossed, his tailored suit still crisp despite the lingering heat of the jet engines. Every so often he would glance at Evan, his lips curling into a faint smirk, as if waiting for the teenager's dramatic warning to fall apart. "You better pray they find something," Hayward said finally, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Because if this turns out to be another waste of my time, I'll make sure you never work in aviation or anywhere else." Evan swallowed hard but didn't respond. Words wouldn't convince Hayward now, only results would. As the minutes dragged on, he scanned the jet, his eyes darting over its smooth surface. It was pristine, a masterpiece of engineering, and yet to Evan, it felt like a ticking time bomb. Pete approached with a clipboard in hand, his expression tight with frustration. "Sir, my team has completed the secondary inspection. Nothing significant to report. The plane is safe to fly." Hayward straightened, his smirk widening into a triumphant grin. "There you have it. Looks like your feeling was just nerves, kid. Now, if you're done playing hero." "Wait," Evan blurted, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. All eyes turned to him, and he could feel the heat of their stares burning into his skin. "What about the auxiliary fuel line? Did anyone check the secondary connectors?" The mechanics exchanged puzzled glances. Pete frowned, clearly annoyed. The auxiliary line wasn't flagged during the initial inspection, and it's not standard to double-check it unless there's a specific reason. "There is a reason," Evan insisted. He pointed toward the underside of the jet. I noticed a tiny shimmer when the engines were running earlier. It could have been nothing, but what if it's a micro leak? Please, just take a look. Hayward groaned, running a hand through his hair. For God's sake, do you think we've got time for this? We've already lost over an hour. Pete hesitated, caught between his irritation and the slim possibility that Evan might have a point. Fine, he said at last. We'll check the auxiliary line, but if this comes up empty, Turner, you're done. The crew set to work, their movements brisk and efficient. Evan held his breath as they inspected the line, running pressure tests and scanning for abnormalities. It felt like an eternity before one of the mechanics suddenly froze. Hey Pete, the mechanic called out. Take a look at this. The tension on the tarmac thickened as Pete crouched beside the mechanic. He peered closely at the section of the line they were inspecting, his brow furrowing. Son of a. There's a pinhole leak here. It's small, but it's there. Evan exhaled sharply, relief washing over him in waves. He wasn't crazy, he wasn't wrong. But his victory was short-lived as Pete stood, his face pale. Mr. Hayward, Pete began, his voice grim. That leak could have been catastrophic if it went unnoticed. The auxiliary fuel line is under high pressure during flight. If it ruptured mid-air. Hayward's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of controlled disbelief. Are you telling me this kid just saved my life? Pete nodded. Yes, sir. It's lucky he spoke up when he did. For a moment, Hayward said nothing. He stared at the jet, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Evan, his gaze piercing. How did you know? Evan hesitated, unsure how to answer. If he mentioned the dreams, Hayward would probably dismiss him as a lunatic. I didn't know for sure, he said carefully, but I had a feeling, an instinct that something wasn't right. Instinct, Hayward repeated, his tone skeptical but not mocking. He studied Evan for a long moment before nodding slowly. Well, whatever it was, it worked. Pete cleared his throat, clearly eager to shift focus away from the near disaster. We'll need to replace the damaged line before this jet can take off. It's going to take a couple of hours, minimum. Hayward sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Fine. Do whatever you need to do, he glanced at Evan again, his gaze softening slightly. And you come with me. Evan blinked, caught off guard. Sir. You heard me, Hayward said, already walking toward the airport lounge. I want to talk to you. Evan exchanged a bewildered look with Pete, who merely shrugged. Reluctantly, Evan followed Hayward into the lounge, his nerves fraying with each step. The billionaire led him to a private corner of the room, where he sank into a leather chair and gestured for Evan to sit opposite him. All right, Hayward began, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Let's get one thing straight. I don't believe in luck, and I don't believe in gut feelings. What I do believe in is evidence. So tell me what made you so sure about that jet. Evan hesitated, his mind racing. Should he be honest about the dreams? Would Hayward take him seriously? Finally, he decided there was no point in lying. It's hard to explain, Evan admitted. For the past few weeks, I've been having these dreams about your jet, crashing, exploding. I don't know why, but when I saw it today, I just knew I couldn't let you get on without saying something. Hayward raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Dreams? That's your big explanation. I know it sounds crazy, Evan said quickly, but I've always had a good sense for when something's off. My dad was the same way. He worked as a flight engineer, and he used to tell me to always trust my instincts. It saved him more than once. Hayward leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he processed Evan's words. So this is a family trait, huh? Intuition runs in your blood. I guess you could say that, Evan replied. He braced himself for Hayward's inevitable ridicule, but the billionaire surprised him. Well, whatever it is, it just saved me a fortune and possibly my life, Hayward said. His tone was grudging but sincere. That doesn't mean I believe in premonitions, but I do respect results. You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. Evan felt a spark of pride at the compliment, though he couldn't ignore the lingering tension in Hayward's voice. The man was clearly not used to being proven wrong, especially by a teenager. Still, Evan was grateful for the acknowledgement. Thank you, sir, he said quietly. Hayward nodded, his sharp features softening slightly. "Keep that instinct of yours sharp. You might need it someday." He stood, brushing off his suit jacket. "Now get back out there, and try not to scare my crew half to death again." Evan grinned despite himself. "Yes, sir." As he returned to the tarmac, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of his encounter with Grant Hayward. If anything, it felt like the beginning of something much larger, a story that had only just begun to unfold. Evan stepped back onto the tarmac, his mind buzzing with everything that had just happened. The Gulfstream G700 loomed in the hangar like a sleeping giant, its repairs underway under the watchful eyes of the crew. The reality of what he'd done was sinking in. He had just confronted a billionaire, saved his plane from a potentially catastrophic accident, and somehow avoided getting fired. But there was no time to relax. Turner Pete's voice cut through the din of tools and machinery. The senior mechanic strode toward him, his expression unreadable. "I don't know how you pulled that off, but don't think you're off the hook. You're still on thin ice." "I get it," Pete Evan replied, nodding earnestly. "I didn't mean to cause a scene. I just—" Yeah, you and your gut feeling." Pete shook his head, though there was a trace of grudging respect in his voice. "You got lucky this time, but don't go thinking you're some kind of aviation prophet. We don't run an airfield on hunches, kid. We run it on facts." Evan nodded again, biting back a retort. He understood where Pete was coming from. His actions had disrupted the entire operation, and nobody wanted to make a habit of second-guessing procedures. But deep down, Evan couldn't ignore the sense of vindication he felt. He had been right, and that had to count for something. As Pete walked away, Evan caught sight of Hayward standing by the service truck, talking quietly with one of his assistants. The billionaire's usually confident demeanor seemed subdued, almost contemplative. Evan wondered if the close call had shaken him more than he let on. Evan busied himself cleaning tools and organizing supplies, trying to stay out of everyone's way. But he couldn't stop glancing over at Hayward, whose gaze occasionally flickered in his direction. It was strange this man, who had barely acknowledged his existence before, now seemed to see him in a new light. Evan wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or not. A short while later, the sound of approaching footsteps made Evan look up. Hayward was walking toward him, his expression thoughtful. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets. "You got a minute?" Kid Hayward asked. Evan blinked, caught off guard. Sure." Hayward gestured for him to follow, leading him toward a quieter corner of the hangar. Once they were out of earshot, he turned to face Evan, his sharp features softened by an unusual seriousness. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Hayward began. "About your dad and trusting your instincts. That kind of intuition. It's not something you see every day." Evan shifted uncomfortably, unsure where this was going. "I guess I just learned to pay attention to the little things. My dad always said details can make the difference between life and death." Hayward nodded, his gaze intense. He was right. "And I have to admit, your attention to detail might have saved me from making a very expensive mistake today." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "How old are you, Turner?" 17, sir." 17, Hayward repeated, almost to himself. "And you've already got the guts to stand up to someone like me. That's impressive." Evan felt his cheeks flush. He wasn't used to receiving praise, especially from someone as powerful as Hayward. I didn't want to stay silent if I thought something was wrong." "That's a rare quality," Hayward said, his tone thoughtful. "Tell me, what are you planning to do with your life? Are you going to stick with aviation?" "Absolutely," Evan said without hesitation. "I want to be a pilot someday." Hayward's lips quirked into a faint smile. "A pilot, huh? Ambitious. But you've got a long way to go." Evan nodded, his determination unwavering. "I know, but I'll get there." Hayward studied him for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card. He handed it to Evan, who took it hesitantly. "My assistant's contact information is on there," Hayward said. "When you're ready to take the next step in your career, give her a call. I might be able to help you out." Evan stared at the card, his mind racing. Was this really happening? A billionaire offering to mentor him or at least open some doors for him? It felt surreal. "Thank you, Mr. Hayward," Evans said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't let you down." "Don't thank me yet," Hayward replied, his tone returning to its usual sharpness. "You've got a lot to prove, kid. But if today is any indication, you might just have what it takes." With that, Hayward turned and walked away, leaving Evan standing there with the card in his hand. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. This wasn't just a second chance, it was an opportunity to change his life. As the Gulfstream's repairs continued, Evan couldn't help but feel that his story with Grant Hayward was far from over. Whatever came next, he was determined to meet it head-on. The Gulfstream G700 sat gleaming on the tarmac under the golden light of the setting sun. The repairs to the auxiliary fuel line were finally complete, and the jet was ready to depart. Mechanics double-checked their work, their movements efficient but tinged with caution after the earlier scare. Evan Turner stood at a distance, watching the team finalize their tasks, his heart heavy with a strange mix of relief and anticipation. Grant Hayward emerged from the airport lounge, his suit jacket slung casually over his shoulder. His usual air of superiority seemed muted, replaced by an almost contemplative demeanor. He paused at the base of the jet steps, surveying the scene with a critical eye. When his gaze landed on Evan, he gave a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that left the teenager feeling equal parts validated and unsettled. The hum of the jet's engines starting up filled the air as Hayward climbed aboard. The door sealed shut behind him, and moments later, the Gulfstream began its slow taxi toward the runway. Evan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. This time, the plane was safe. He had made sure of it. As the jet disappeared into the sky, Pete walked over, clapping Evan on the shoulder. "Well, kid, looks like you got lucky twice today. First, saving Hayward's bacon, and second, not getting fired. You really dodged a bullet." Evan offered a small smile, though he felt anything but lucky. He still couldn't shake the image of the jet crashing, flames consuming it midair. The dreams had felt so real, so vivid. Was it just a coincidence that his gut instinct had turned out to be right? Or was there something more to it? Pete leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Word of advice, Turner, don't make a habit of sticking your neck out like that. It might have worked this time, but next time, you might not be so lucky." "I'll keep that in mind," Evan replied, though he knew he couldn't promise to ignore his instincts if it meant someone's life was at stake. As Pete walked away, Evan reached into his pocket and pulled out the sleek black business card Hayward had given him. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the potential for everything he'd ever dreamed of or everything he feared. 2 weeks later, Evan sat in his small bedroom, the card still on his desk where he had placed it the night he got home from the airfield. He hadn't called Hayward's assistant yet. Something about the offer felt too good to be true, as though there had to be a catch. But every time he looked at it, he thought about what Hayward had said: "You've got a lot to prove, kid. But if today is any indication, you might just have what it takes." The words replayed in his mind like a challenge, daring him to step into a world he'd only ever dreamed of. Finally, after another night of restless sleep, Evan picked up the phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a professional voice answered. Grant Hayward's office. "Hi, this is Evan Turner," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "Mr. Hayward told me to call. I'd like to take him up on his offer." The assistant paused, then replied, "One moment, Mr. Turner. Let me connect you." Evan held his breath as the line clicked, and a deep, familiar voice came on. "Evan, I was wondering how long it would take you to call." "Mr. Hayward," Evan began, his throat suddenly dry. "I wasn't sure if the offer was still on the table." "It is," Hayward said. "And I'm glad you called. Meet me at my office tomorrow. Let's talk about what's next." The next day, Evan found himself standing outside a towering glass skyscraper in the heart of downtown. The building seemed to stretch into the clouds, its sleek design a testament to Hayward's wealth and influence. As Evan stepped into the lobby, he couldn't help but feel out of place in his simple button-up shirt and slacks. The receptionist directed him to the top floor, and moments later he was ushered into Hayward's sprawling office. The view from the windows was breathtaking, the city sprawling beneath them like a living, breathing entity. "Evan," Hayward said, standing to greet him. "Glad you could make it." "Thanks for having me, sir," Evan replied, his voice steady despite the nerves buzzing under his skin. Hayward gestured for him to sit. Let's get to the point. You've got potential. I saw that the other night. But potential isn't enough. If you want to make it in this industry, you need training, discipline, and opportunities, and I can give you all three. Evan's heart raced. What do you mean? I've arranged for you to start at an aviation academy, Hayward said. It's one of the best in the country. I'll cover the tuition, but the rest is up to you. Think of it as an investment in both you and my peace of mind. Evan stared at him, disbelief flooding his senses. Why would you do that for me? Hayward leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Because I don't believe in luck, Turner. I believe in talent. And I think you've got it. For the first time in weeks, Evan allowed himself to believe that his dreams might just be within reach. Evan's head spun as he left Grant Hayward's office. The billionaire's offer felt surreal, like stepping into a life he had only dared to dream about. Training at an elite aviation academy, fully funded by one of the most powerful men in the industry, wasn't an opportunity most 17-year-olds got. Yet doubt gnawed at the edges of his excitement. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he let Hayward down? Or worse, what if this was some elaborate test he was destined to fail? By the time he reached the street, his nerves had begun to settle. He clutched the folder Hayward's assistant had given him, detailing the next steps: the academy's address, an orientation schedule, and a plane ticket for his trip to the school on the West Coast. The ticket's departure date was just 10 days away. Evan took a deep breath, staring up at the towering skyscraper behind him. You've got this, he muttered to himself. You've made it this far. Evan's plane touched down on the runway at San Carlos Regional Airport in California. Unlike the bustling commercial airports he was used to, San Carlos was smaller, quieter, and felt strangely personal. Stepping off the plane, he was greeted by a crisp breeze carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby Pacific Ocean. A car was waiting for him, as promised. The driver, a friendly man named Miguel, helped load Evan's single suitcase into the trunk. Excited for your first day? Miguel asked as they pulled away from the terminal. Yeah, Evan replied, though his voice betrayed his nerves. A little nervous, too. Miguel chuckled. You wouldn't be human if you weren't. But you'll be fine. Hayward doesn't back losers. If he thinks you've got what it takes, you do. The academy was nestled on a sprawling campus just outside the city. As they drove through the gates, Evan's jaw dropped. The place was beautiful. Modern hangars lined the runway, and the main building gleamed with glass and steel. The sky above was dotted with small planes, their pilots practicing loops and maneuvers against a backdrop of rolling hills. This is it, Miguel said, pulling to a stop outside the main entrance. Good luck, kid. Evan stepped out of the car, clutching his bag tightly. He barely had time to take it all in before a voice called out to him. Evan Turner. He turned to see a tall, no-nonsense woman striding toward him. She wore a crisp uniform and a pair of aviator sunglasses that reflected the sunlight. I'm Captain Riley, your orientation instructor. Follow me. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of training, lectures, and hands-on practice. Captain Riley was a tough but fair mentor who quickly recognized Evan's potential. You've got good instincts, she told him one afternoon after a particularly grueling session in the flight simulator. But instincts alone won't get you through this. You've got to sharpen your skills and learn to trust the data, too. Evan worked harder than he ever had in his life. He pored over manuals, memorized flight patterns, and pushed himself to his limits in the cockpit. But despite the challenges, he felt alive in a way he never had before. He was really doing it. Hayward kept in touch, though their conversations were brief and businesslike. How's the academy treating you? He'd ask during the occasional phone call. Challenging Evan would reply honestly. But I'm learning a lot. Good, Hayward would say. Keep at it. It wasn't exactly a warm relationship, but Evan didn't mind. Hayward had given him a chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. Evan's hands gripped the controls of a sleek Piper Archer as he taxied to the runway. It was his first solo flight, a milestone every pilot remembered. Captain Riley's voice came through his headset, calm and steady. All right, Turner. You're clear for takeoff. Remember your training. Evan nodded, his heart pounding. Copy that. As he guided the plane down the runway, the vibrations under his seat gave way to the smooth, exhilarating sensation of liftoff. The ground fell away beneath him, and the horizon stretched out endlessly. He was really flying alone for the first time. The radio buzzed with instructions from air traffic control, and Evan responded with confidence. The months of rigorous training had prepared him for this moment, and he felt every lesson clicking into place as he navigated the skies. The world below was a patchwork of green fields and winding roads, the kind of view that had inspired his love for aviation in the first place. After completing a series of maneuvers and confirming his return to the airfield, Evan brought the plane in for a smooth landing. As the wheels touched the runway, a wave of pride washed over him. He had done it. Captain Riley was waiting for him on the tarmac, her arms crossed but a rare smile on her face. "Not bad, Turner. Not bad at all." Evan grinned, climbing out of the cockpit. "Thanks, Captain." She nodded, her expression turning serious. "Hayward's coming to visit next week. I hope you're ready to show him what you've learned." Evan's stomach fluttered. He hadn't seen Hayward since that day in the hangar. "I will be." When Hayward arrived, the Academy staff treated him like royalty. Evan, however, saw through the polished facade. Hayward wasn't here for pleasantries, he was here to see if his investment had paid off. The two met in one of the hangars, surrounded by the hum of activity. Hayward studied Evan for a moment before speaking. "You look different," he said, more confident. "Thanks," Evan replied. "I've been working hard." "I can see that," Hayward said. "But talk is cheap. Show me what you've got." Evan spent the next hour demonstrating his skills, from pre-flight checks to an advanced simulation. Hayward watched closely, his expression unreadable. When it was over, he nodded once, as if satisfied. "You've come a long way," Hayward said. "But don't get comfortable. The real world is a lot tougher than any simulator." "I know," Evan said. "And I'm ready." Hayward's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I believe you are." Evan's journey was just beginning. Over the years, he would face new challenges and reach new heights, but he would always remember the moment that started it all, standing on the tarmac, trusting his instincts, and speaking up when it mattered most. As he soared above the clouds, the world spread out before him like an endless canvas. Evan knew one thing for sure: he was exactly where he was meant to be.